My name is Dario Hasenstab, and I'm here with Balder Hagritz, and we are back with the Western Bubble podcast. Hi, Balder. Why are we speaking about institutional decline in foreign policy? Because last week we already spoke about institutional decline in universities.
Hi Dario. Well, indeed, as we already announced, this is the second of a three-parter, right, where we really want to delve into what does institutional decline within the Western bubble actually look like. And foreign policy is, of course, the topic closest to my daily life because that's what I'm involved in for a job besides my work at university. And the issue that we face as the West right now is that foreign policy is all over the place. Foreign policy is no longer focused, it's no longer clear, it's sort of torn apart by different kinds of agendas. One very practical, and one a legacy, a remnant of ideology from the past. And that leads to institutions at a foreign policy level basically failing their partners around the world and failing themselves. And that's what we will analyze today with two very specific and recent examples, namely Georgia and Armenia, which are two countries that have been pulled at by the West, traditionally within the sphere of influence of Russia, but the West would very much like to pry it away from Russia, put it within the NATO bubble, if you like. But there is no longer a consistent, coherent policy towards these two countries, and as a result, they are now in limbo. They're basically torn apart by Russia on the one hand, the West on the other hand, with no one actually taking responsibility.
And what are the facts?
Protests have rocked Georgia since the beginning of May as their government attempts to pass a bill that would recognize any organization receiving over 20% funding from non domestic sources as a foreign agent. The US and EU have responded by warning Georgia that passing this bill will strain relations and be seen as democratic backsliding. Young Georgians have taken to the streets, worried that their government's actions will prevent them from joining the EU. In Armenia, the historic Russian ally is turning to Western powers, such as the EU, after Russia failed to adequately respond to the ongoing conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh with Azerbaijan. The European Parliament responded with a resolution on March 13th, endorsing the development of a closer relationship with Armenia and a joint EU-US Armenia high-level meeting was held on April 5th.
What is the bubble?
So, before we talk about foreign policy specifically related to the cases of Armenia and Georgia, it makes sense to kind of look at Western foreign policy in the last, 70, 75 years, basically since the Second World War, because we can make a lot of claims about the institutional decline in foreign policy, but then we would actually need to prove that there is a decline. Maybe foreign policy in the West has always been terrible. There are cases to be made here.
Well, yes, I think you can absolutely make the case that foreign policy by any country, certainly by powerful countries, have awful elements in them always throughout history, right? But there is a difference between awful in the sense of being ethically problematic, morally problematic, destructive, and colonization, wars, all kind. You can point at Western behavior over the past few hundred years. You can look at even the Crusades and ask some very obvious questions about whether that was the right or wrong thing to do. But that is different from the question of whether the foreign policy is consistent and coherent and whether there's actually an objective in mind that the West wants to achieve something. So the West wanted to conquer the Americas and wanted the gold from colonies and wanted the resources from colonies and maybe wanted to convert people to the Christian faith. You can think and believe all kinds of things about that, but at least there was an objective and there was a policy in place. And what we're going to analyze today is that that objective and purpose is lacking in the 21st century, is lacking in 2024. And it's interesting, we'll talk a little bit about that path, but in your fact sheet, you mentioned that basically the West have warned Georgia that it will be seen, what they're doing right now will be seen as democratic backsliding. And that is like the perfect example of essentially a meaningless statement in 2024. There's democratic backsliding everywhere. There is no consequence to democratic backsliding. The West is not saying, oh, now we don't want you anymore. They're also not saying we do want you anymore. They're not saying anything with it. It's almost that like a Pavlovian knee-jerk reaction of, oh, democratic backsliding, we have to call it out, without any foreign policy, without any strength behind it, right?
Let's before we go to that part, why is a coherent and objective-driven foreign policy important? I mean, right, because foreign policy is the extension of domestic policy, right, into other countries, basically making sure that what I want domestically also happens internationally. But why is it important that this is coherent? I mean, what if my mood changes?
Well, I guess you can actually make that comparison with an individual whose mood changes, right? So, just like an individual is not, an individual is never perfectly consistent and perfectly coherent. We are not completely rational human beings. That would turn us into robots. We're not. We have mood swings, we've got irrational behavior, but there is a difference between someone who once in a while is in a slightly bad mood or someone who is, for example, bipolar, or someone who has enormously big changes in the way that they behave towards the outside world. And if it's the latter, if someone has these very violent changes in their behavior and doesn't really know why they behave like that, then that will be bad for them. That will be destructive for them. If you compare that to an individual who is actually quite consistent in their interaction with others around them, who is quite dependable, who can be relied on when help is needed, that is someone who will have friends. That is someone who will find it easier to get something back from their surroundings. So volatility and lack of purpose are bad for an individual human being in the same way that they are bad for foreign policy for a country. Now, just like that human being, foreign policy of the West has never been completely consistent. In fact, it's impossible because of the enormous complexity. Foreign policy making is messy. Loads of actors are involved. There are government changes. There are individual changes of ministers. There are lobby groups that change policy overnight. But there is a significant difference in the way that foreign policy was made during the Cold War, for example, as compared to now in 2024.
I remember this was one of the main worries about Donald Trump, is that it wasn't necessarily what he would say, but that from one day to another, this would change, right? And I mean, we've talked about this very concretely with the Kurds fighting on behalf of the United States in Syria. And then suddenly, from one night to another, right, one phone call with the Turkish president, then Trump dropped the Kurds. We said, you know what, you hot potato them away, Erdogan, you come in. And with this, I mean, right, damaging credibility, damaging reliability, and just upsetting the whole foreign policy apparatus in the United States.
And I would point at that moment where he withdrew support for the Kurds as probably one of his, if not the worst foreign policy decision he made. Exactly that volatility, exactly as you describe, is very, very damaging and is going to have long-lasting consequences. 10 years down the line, I can almost guarantee you that we will hear back from the Kurds, right? There will be a reaction and historians will say, hey, this was the moment that things went wrong, just like you can point at other such moments in time. But interestingly enough, Trump had one advantage. Yes, he was very volatile. He is very volatile, but he is not ideological. He doesn't, I mean, I don't want to call people names, but you could probably call him a narcissist. He's narcissistic, but he doesn't have a view of the world. So basically, in some ways, he became consistent. He just wanted to do what was best for him at a foreign policy level without needing liberalism or realism to explain to him how the United States is supposed to operate on the global stage. So if we were to evaluate Trump's presidency, I would argue that the damage that he has done has been more domestically than at a foreign policy level. The the situation with the Kurds was sort of an outlier because most of his behavior was simply, hey, I want to do business with people and that's it. And that in itself can be quite consistent.
Very much indeed. Let's then actually look at, 50, 60 years ago, at the West's foreign policy. And we're starting with the Cold War. You already mentioned it. And there the West had a very clear foreign policy objective, right? Okay, post-World War II, fascism, Nazism has been defeated. That's no longer a threat to our model and our way of life, right? Because there was a direct threat to basically the Western liberal model. Now the Nazis are defeated. Okay, there's another group out there, the Soviets. They were our friends, more partners, a few months ago. But now, basically, they're the other big party in town, and we are worried about them threatening our way of life, whether that's the case or not.
Yes, I don't think the West ever believed the Soviet Union were friends, right? I just from a historical accuracy perspective, I think it's important to point out that one of the reasons why France and especially the UK let Hitler get as far as he did was because they thought, okay, fascism is probably not great, but it's at least not as bad as communism, right? So they saw Germany as a bulwark against the communist threat. So the communist threat had always been there. After the Second World War, once fascism was defeated, then the fight against communism was taken up again, and that led to the Cold War. And there you see Western foreign policy being arguably deeply immoral, immoral with respect to regime change in Latin America, propping up dictatorships, immoral with respect to starting wars in Southeast Asia, Vietnam as the worst case probably, Cambodia, immoral with respect to supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa because believing that otherwise the ANC would turn towards the Soviet Union or turn towards China. So in that sense, immoral. Now, I should always point out here that morality is a subjective perspective. So what is immoral to me might not be immoral to every listener out there. But it was clear. We have an existential enemy. The West believed that they were existentially threatened by the Soviet Union. And so their foreign policy was more or less consistently focused on that, with a little bit of volatility, with mistakes that were being made, very big mistakes, but the West knew what it wanted. And foreign policy, in that sense, could be labeled relatively coherent and consistent.
And then after the end of the Cold War, suddenly that is gone, right? That like one big opposing side that you orient your foreign policy towards is gone. We've talked about this plenty of times that suddenly you've won history. And then it becomes about, okay, now that our model reigns supreme on the hill, because we obviously won against the communists, now the big goal is just to spread our model to the rest of the world and basically convince everyone in different ways to adopt democracy, capitalism, and the liberal order.
And for a short period of time, that actually seemed to be consistent and coherent as well, because first of all, the West truly believed it, as we've discussed multiple times. The 1990s, they were absolutely, it was sort of the height of liberal democratic ideology, and there was this almost festive atmosphere in the Western world saying history is done. So their foreign policy became very much about telling the rest of the world, get on board, get in line. You know, if you haven't received the memo, here it is, but you have to now turn to us. You have to become liberal. You have to become democratic. We will reach out our hands to help you. We'll pull you through if necessary. If you don't want to, we might actually try to force you. That typically doesn't work out very well, by the way, at a foreign policy level. Trying to militarily, especially force countries to do something, typically is not a good idea. But there was a consistent idea of, we now know what to do. We've got a plan. We've got a purpose. We're going to turn the world into us. And we're going to do whatever is needed in order to achieve that. And the rest of the world knew that. It was one of the reasons why Russia under Yeltsin, I mean, Yeltsin was also very much fighting internal forces, but why Russia under Yeltsin was willing to receive so many consultants from the West telling Russia how to become liberal and democratic, right? There was a short moment of maybe 5 years, maybe 10 at most, where the world actually more or less had to at least play along with this story and knew what the West was doing. Not everyone agreed with it, but it was clear what the purpose was. Unfortunately, that very much has changed now, 25 years later.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the conversation we had at the beginning, right? Because I feel like we cannot stress this enough how important it is to be consistent in your behavior towards the rest of the world, right? On the individual level, but also on a country level. That, okay, I mean, particularly when there's a strong force, right? When there's strong individuals out there that let's say maybe to some of our younger audiences, right? That there's a professor and he grades consistently, so you know exactly what to expect for I don't know for your paper and what to include, or that at work it's clear that okay, these are these expectations, and you can basically or like kind of look at that and say, okay, let me adapt to this behavior and I will do that. And that was very much the case here with the West, right? I mean, okay, they want democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth. Okay, so me and my country's development, I can model basically after that. Whether I do this ultimately, that's still my decision, and I might do it or might not.
Yeah, and you need to know what the rules are. So you might not like that professor. In fact, you might not agree with the professor. You might think that the professor is horrible, but at least if the professor is consistent and lays out the clear rules, then you know what to expect and you can work with that and you can react to that. And if your friend is the nicest person in the world for most days, but once in a while turns really violent, then that friendship will probably very quickly end. Because it's scary. You know, you can have a person who is for 6 days a week is the best person ever, supportive in any way, but then on the seventh day actually becomes a monster. Well, then that is very damaging to your relationship with that person, right? That is destructive. That is not something that you can then predict. It is not something that you can work with, and you turn away from that person. So consistency, knowing the rules, whether you like those rules or not, and those rules being consistently implemented is absolutely fundamental at a foreign policy level. And if the West once in a while makes a mistake and deviates from its own rules, then at least there's a certain accountability, right? So, for example, you can look at the mistakes that were being made when it comes to the Balkans, for example, and there were significant mistakes being made in the 1990s. You can look at the complete ineptitude and indifference and lack of action when it came to the Rwandan genocide. But at least you can assess that within the Western framework. And you can say, this was a clear mistake. This was a moment that you deviated from your consistent foreign policy. What lessons can be learned from this?
And consistent foreign policy, right? Because we said at the beginning as well that if your foreign policy is consistent and bad, that's still a bad thing. But that can be changed if you know the rules of the game and you can play within these rules and basically say, hey, okay, maybe this foreign policy attitude, I don't know, let's say towards development aid is not very good. We should kind of deviate from that because there's clear criticisms, and according to the rules of the game, this is how I can influence it and change that.
Absolutely. So the best example for that is Kissinger, right? Kissinger in the 70s with Nixon, and later as an advisor to other administrations, applied policies that most people nowadays would deeply, deeply reject. I already mentioned Cambodia previously. Kissinger probably did some or made some choices, pushed for some policy initiatives that are now deemed deeply immoral. Okay, but we can assess that and we can say, how did this work? And what can we do to avoid these mistakes happening in the future? There is something to evaluate. There is something to verify because the pillars, the foundations are clear. And once the pillars aren't clear, when the foundations aren't clear, that's when you're in much deeper trouble, especially from a Western perspective itself, right? The moment you don't know the morning how you will wake up in the morning and how you will behave, that's the moment when your life will start falling apart.
Mm. And we are now, as the West, in that moment when the life seems to be falling apart for two reasons, right? And I mean, so this is most clearly visible for two reasons. The first one being that we are, and this is something we've criticized consistently, that we are living in a very managerial mindset in very managerial times when it comes to Western leaders. And the second one being that, contrary to expectations and predictions, maybe other countries who do not adopt the Western model are doing well. Let's start with the managerial mindset, the managerial approach. I mean, what's problematic with this on a foreign policy level?
Well, it should be pointed out that it's deeply ironic in some ways, right? That at a moment that it seems that the West celebrates its ideology and says, "Hey, we figured out the best way to organize society," is then also the moment that they say, "Okay, so now we can just become managerial and do away with that ideology." We've discussed that previously. Now, if you look at Trump, you mentioned Trump before, and you think of Trump as someone who just manages his own agenda, is managerial in that sense, then that is probably not the end of the world. It's not great, but at least there is some consistency there. But if you now have a West over the past 25 years that has a legacy, a remnant of ideology, still believes in its own superiority, still believes in the Western bubble, believes that somehow they've got the right system and they are somehow more advanced than the rest of society because they can point at their elections and they can point at their human rights and those kinds of things. But in reality, tries to behave in a managerial way, then those two things start clashing and you get this kind of bipolar policymaking process. You get a policymaking process that on the one hand just really cares about profit making, about satisfying business, about making sure that there's stability, that international trade functions well. And on the other hand, you've got a sort of a lingering air, an environment in which people still believe that ideologically there is something there, that there is still something that takes precedence over everything else. And that means that if you're China or you're India or you're South Africa or Nigeria or Brazil, your life dealing with the West becomes really, really difficult. It becomes very hard because their foreign policy on one moment will be, can we please invest in your country because we like your natural resources? And the other moment it becomes about, oh, there's democratic backsliding. We don't like your elections. And the West doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't know in what mood it will wake up in the morning. And the rest of the world finds the West a incredibly unreliable negotiating partner.
And at the same time, the rest of the world, or at least some countries in the rest of the world, have been doing well. I mean, and so the country to mention here is China. Is that at first there was always business being done with China, right? Because it's a good country to invest, workforce, young, well educated, also rather cheap to produce there. Those are all great things. But they are not really adopting that Western model, and still they're doing well. That doesn't really fit into my view of the world, right? Because we had one history just 20 years ago.
Indeed, and we enthusiastically opened our arms for China to join the World Trade Organization and to become part of all the institutions because we knew that China would become like us sooner rather than later. Now, and it's interesting that China not just has actually done really well, but they've been doing well by being the anti-West, right? Not to call it the anti-Christ, because that creates a whole different conversation, but the anti-West in the sense that exactly this inconsistency in foreign policy making, and I've seen this with my own eyes, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo have this choice of a negotiation with the West where they have to navigate a really volatile and inconsistent narrative about, oh, democracy is really important, but we really, really want your natural resources as well. And those two things clash and it becomes very confusing. And it becomes almost like doing business with someone who is bipolar, or, whatever other disrespectful psychological term you can put on it. I don't know, schizophrenic or whatever else you can attach to it. But it becomes a very unreliable process because you don't know what's going on. And my apologies to people suffering from schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Or you can do business with China, which actually has a very consistent message. Okay, we have a ideology internally. We believe ourselves to be a one-party state, call it communist, call it whatever you like, but we have absolutely no interest in exporting that to you because that's our business. We just want your resources and that's it. We just care about the economics. We care about the financing. And then those sub-Saharan African countries and also increasingly Latin American countries say, well, I'd much rather deal with that. I don't know if I can really relate to China at an ideological level, but I don't need to because China doesn't demand it from me.
And so these two factors, right, that very managerial aspect and the fact that other regions, other countries in the world are doing better, this we can kind of see with two foreign policy tools or players that the West has. So we have NATO and the European Union, who both are incredibly managerial, at least for the last 30 years, particularly the European Union, but also NATO as well, right? I mean, NATO always had that mission of, okay, let's make sure the West stays on top, and particularly militarily, and Europe basically saying, okay, let's make sure that no war breaks out and we'll kind of unify more. But that has been it, right? So very managerial in its approach. And at the same time, you see other players now kind of starting to poke basically those two big bears. And those two are completely failing with a foreign policy because they're not really foreign policy tools, but the West treats them as foreign policy tools.
Yeah, and this says something about how blinded the West was in the 1990s, because that's when these two institutions were basically positioned. They weren't created, but they were positioned in the 1990s to become these tools, to become tools of this undeniable future for the whole of humanity. And why I'm saying that this shows the blindness is that neither of these organizations is capable of doing this. And this should be obvious to anyone who understands the basic fundamentals of them. On the one hand, you've got the EU, which was set up as an internal project. Well, internal within Europe. So you could call it foreign policy, but it was foreign policy between Germany and France, and foreign policy between the Netherlands and Italy in order to create a consistent European bloc. Had nothing to do with the outside world. It wasn't supposed to be some kind of open invitation to everyone else to join. It was set up as a way to avoid a new world war between powerful nations within Western Europe that discovered that they have more in common than they thought. And then to basically corrupt that, or to try to desperately squeeze that into a foreign policy tool where you say, hey, Ukraine, feel free to join. If you want to Georgia, feel free to join. That actually is inconsistent with the very foundational ideology of the European Union. Now, some people, Ursula von der Leyen, if she hears me say this, I don't think she's a listener, but she might actually call me and say, hey, Balder, what are you talking about? The European Union stands for democratic liberal values. Well, yeah, yes and no, because the European Union very much also stands for business and stands exactly, it is that inconsistent foreign policy narrative. The only thing that the European Union really can claim to do is be a tool for the core European countries to work together on joint issues, and that's it.
I mean, speaking of consistency in the European Union, right? The only thing where the EU has been really consistent at is that single market and is basically that unifying of standards across the 27 member states. And that is working amazing for the European Union because that's exactly what it was set up for, right? But now try to cramp foreign policy into a block of 27 countries that are supposed to speak with one voice.
And yeah, that becomes almost impossible. It's kind of horrifying for me to see that the one voice where they seem to get have some kind of consistency is immigration. All right, listeners will know my perspectives on that, but that's the one place where they can say, okay, let's invest in Tunisia to avoid immigrants coming in. Okay, fine, whatever. But the inconsistency when it is, for example, dealing with Ukraine is there to see for everyone. Whether it is about Ukrainian grain imports or whether it is about Ukraine actually joining the European Union. Everyone deep down inside in Brussels knows that Ukraine will not join the European Union, that it can't for a lot of reasons. And yet they dangle it in front of Ukraine, exactly showing that incoherence, right? They want to, Ursula von der Leyen and others want to, because they believe that they're on some kind of ideological mission to incorporate Ukraine and protect it from evil Russia. But at the same time, managerially speaking, it's just never ever going to happen. And that is very destructive for Ukrainian people. It's very destructive for the European Union as well, because it's no longer a reliable partner like that.
And next to the European Union, you have this other player, which is NATO. And NATO is facing, I mean, NATO at least has the United States, which is kind of right, that hegemon that's kind of leading everyone together, and you kind of have to obey by the rules. So it's not the same confusion as is in the European Union, but that doesn't mean that the results are any better.
So NATO is a product of the Cold War, and for all intents and purposes, it would have made sense for NATO in 1995 to say, okay, look, we're done. There's no longer a Soviet threat. Russia is now sort of supposedly liberalizing, and even if they aren't, we are no longer legitimate in our existence. However, NATO continued to exist nonetheless. It became active in the Balkans, and now it is seen as some kind of defensive alliance against Russia and potentially China and everyone else. Okay, fine. NATO is seen as a defense mechanism for the West, those willing to join. But there's absolutely no foundation in NATO to somehow become an exporter of liberalism or of democracy. That's never what it was supposed to do. It was to defend the democratic and liberal nations that existed. It wasn't supposed to be a political organ that would actually turn the world into us. And once again, what you see with NATO is that it's torn between those two things. On the one hand, there is this ideological tone. On the other hand, the only reason why they still exist is that it's a very efficient, very strongly managed defense mechanism. And those two things don't go hand in hand. They don't work together. So we've got two tools, core tools, that are ineffective, that are illegitimate in basically spreading the Western bubble, if you like.
And I think the very good example for basically ineffectiveness of NATO to spread the West or Western ideals is Turkey, right? Because Turkey was added to NATO for its strategic location, right between the three continents, also like an emerging player, and so on and so forth. Was also at some point invited to join the European Union. But the systems are completely different. And now you actually see Turkey going away from that, right? Talking about democratic backsliding into a wrong direction, which further tears basically the West apart here.
Yeah, so Turkey at the time was a secular nation, was very much aligned, at least on paper, with some of these American and Western European values. Now it very clearly isn't, and that's a major headache. But NATO should never have been an aggressive tool to spread the word. That's not what NATO is there for. And exactly what you said about Turkey also supposedly at some point joining the European Union. Everyone knew at the time that Turkey wasn't going to join the European Union. Everyone knew that it wasn't going to happen, and yet people dangled it in front of Ankara as some kind of prize to be had. And the result is that now in 2024, Turkey has very much moved away from that, and NATO has a consistent problem with Erdogan and with his successors, undoubtedly. So there has never been consistent thinking about how can we actually implement our foreign policy in the 21st century in a way that's coherent. There's never been a consistent thinking about the tools available, and there's never been a genuine recognition that the EU nor NATO are the right tools to actually spread somehow Western values around the world. That's not what they were made to do.
What's the international relations context?
So we already talked about Turkey, we already talked about Ukraine as case studies, but we do want to dive into two case studies a little bit deeper here. And those are the ones we mentioned in the beginning and in the fact sheet in particular, Georgia and Armenia, right? Because I think those are, when we look at, the West still basically wanting to follow those foreign policy goals from the 1990s and before, right, of basically spreading the West and fighting others and so on, then theoretically adding, right, basically aiding Georgia in kind of its battle against Russia, right? I mean, Georgia is one of those countries where there's also two regions, or 20% of the country basically occupied by Russia. And they are very European in their mindset, right? So it would make sense to basically bring them in and say, hello, Georgia, yes, please come and join us. But that's not enough, as we just discussed with Turkey. You can't just say, hey, Georgia, how about you join us tomorrow for dinner? And then never send them any information of how to actually get in or invite them actually 3 times for dinner, and you never really follow up.
Yeah, so if European foreign policy was purely driven by ideology, or Western foreign policy purely driven by ideology, then they could do it. I mean, they could just say, hey, Armenia, hey, Georgia, please join us. Here you've got access, because we want you to become part of our happy liberal democratic family, and we believe in you. But that would clash with the managerial interest. That would clash with the actual relations with Russia, with China, with the Middle East, with Azerbaijan, and therefore the West is not willing to do that. And so once again, they tear these countries apart. Just like with Turkey, just like with Ukraine, dangling a vague sense of, if you're good, if you're a good boy, you can join us. If you behave according to our rules, if you don't have too much democratic backsliding, and you're open to doing business with us, then we can make you part of our family. But deep down inside, everyone knows that it's not going to happen, not in a consistent way. And if you want to see any evidence of this, just look at the way that Europe was deeply, deeply confused about how to behave when Azerbaijan basically reincorporated the enclave Nagorno-Karabakh into its territory, and basically said to Armenia, sorry, you don't have any friends in high places. Russia is concerned about the way that you are getting close to the West. The West doesn't really know what to do with you. The West doesn't really know what it wants with you. So we will take back what we believe is ours. Thank you very much. It's a very clear example of a country, in this case Armenia, being the victim of inconsistent, vague foreign policy by Western powers.
Absolutely. I mean, well, I think the West here was torn in other ways too, right? Because the UN officially recognizes Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan in that sense, right? So you're kind of in this limbo of, do I stick with the international organization I've created, or do I stick with my friends because Azerbaijan, for other reasons, aka being close to Turkey and non-Christian, and they have a lot of gas and they use that gas for their own advantages, right? So we don't really like Azerbaijan. So we're really torn of whom to support here. So let's just sit it out. Let's just do nothing.
It's a good thing you mentioned the UN here, because that's, as we've mentioned in previous episodes. So these institutions that were created are now no longer really that effective from a Western perspective, because they don't do what the West wants them to do. And that creates even more ambiguity, creates even more complexity. Do we actually support the UN? Well, we kind of have to, right? Do we support the ICC? Well, we kind of have to. But why is the ICC now listening to South Africa? Why aren't they listening to us? There is so much confusion in foreign policy making at the moment. A lot of it is this Pavlovian ideological behavior at the core that then clashes with the simple, practical business interest. And I really believe that there the West can learn from China. where China has created this wall between their domestic ideology and their domestic beliefs, saying, hey, we're comfortable with who we are domestically, and don't let anyone tell us how to behave domestically, because that's our business. But at a global level, we will not do that either. We will not start telling other countries how they should run their country. That's up to them.
I quickly want to go back to the example of Georgia, because we've mentioned this managerial approach, and so in the past, right, when I was looking into different jobs, I was also in talks with a media company, right, who are basically doing media campaigns for countries, for companies, for organizations. And they basically wanted to get me on a project, right? And this is publicly available information, where they basically said, hey, the European Union is asking us to prepare a communication campaign for Georgia to basically influence the domestic policy or the domestic opinion that the European Union is good. That's the definition of middle management, right? Oh, we don't know what to do. Let's do a communications campaign because we don't really want to do any concrete. We don't want to take any concrete steps. We maybe lack the money. We are too divided. But you know what? We have budget for a communication campaign. We don't need to agree on this. So let's just do that. And then, if all the Georgians agree, then it's easier to take them in. That's not foreign policy. That's management.
Yeah, the same as let's commission a report, right, on what our strategy should be like over the next 10 years. And while that is happening, Georgia is facing very, very serious pressures from Russia and from its internal domestic population. So on the one hand, you've got Ursula von der Leyen saying something vague like Georgia is at a crossroads. This is an actual quote. Basically suggesting that Georgia has some kind of big choice to make. But on the other hand, they've got real practical forces trying, to influencing their policy making from Moscow and internally. And so Europeans and Westerners just doing this kind of, as you call it, middle management approach, vaguely making some promises, vaguely making some statements without anything to back it up, while at the same time other forces are taking over, typifies exactly the problem that Western foreign policy is facing. Going back to Armenia, you can see this the same thing. In Armenia, while Azerbaijan was taking over what Armenia believed to be its legitimate territory, the West was just making a few claims about, we want peaceful negotiations to take place, etc., etc. Russia very specifically said, sorry, we're withdrawing our peacekeeping troops. We're kind of okay with Azerbaijan doing it because we want to punish you for your pro-Western stance. It is essentially the rest of the world seeing the West as the emperor without clothes, right? The emperor making big statements, but if you want to have real business, if you want to have real policy making, you have to look at other countries. You have to look at Russia, you have to look at China, you have to look at India, because the West is no longer reliable.
And can you explain to our listeners what is the problem?
And that's already the damage. I mean, the West is not reliable because there's a lack of consistency within Western foreign policy, because institutions, right, foreign policy institutions are basically in decline. And this is very much going back to why we are recording these episodes, because now, let's be honest, the foreign ministries are there for fancy campaigns, for maybe some development aid, for having nice trips. Right, I don't always want to talk about Germany, but that's simply the case I'm most familiar with. But the German foreign ministry doesn't do any serious foreign policy. No, it's fancy trips all over the world, meeting with friends, right? Sometimes meeting with non-friends, and then trying to be really important because hosting peace talks, right? But Germany is a paper tiger here.
Well, the typical German criticism, self-reflection. the German foreign policy that does work is is basically the business foreign policy, right? And basically saying, hey, we want our exports to be guaranteed. We want our resources to be available. Those kinds of things. That's where German foreign policy shines. But the moment it gets political, the moment it becomes ideological, it's all over the place and it's confusing and it's unreliable.
It's terrible, right? Because I mean, German foreign policy for years, for decades, was basically guided by the principle, right, of change through trade. So that, hey, if we trade with them and we impose, because I mean, if they want to trade with us, we impose our labor laws, we impose our regulations, we make sure that people, like, right, the people producing the products we are consuming are getting treated fairly.
Very much in line with the 1990s in general, right? Through trade, this is all going to happen.
Exactly, right. And so saying that, hey, this is all we want. That, I mean, throwing it completely aboard after the Russian invasion, basically now saying, okay, you know what, we're now going to do a real hard power foreign policy because we can do that for sure. Right. I mean, so yes, you can have a change once in a while as long as you're consistent. But now there is no real change, right? So there was hey, this consistent policy, and now there's a lot of talk and going left and right, and depending on the country, and not we are friends or we're not friends. It really depends on the mood of the day because, you know, maybe the government wakes up on the wrong side of the bed.
Yeah, and I think this is in some ways very recognizable to everyone who lives in the West. This problem that we, again, at an individual level as well as at a country level have, we're essentially in an identity crisis. Because if you ask someone what you care about really at the moment, well, depending on their political leanings, it will be climate change, or it will be poverty if you're maybe more politically left. It will be immigration, or it will be I don't know, a business environment or job creation, if you're more on the right. But no one has as a priority democracy or liberalism to be spread around the world. People don't care about that. They care about it maybe for their own country, but they don't care about it for the rest of the world. And yet, if you ask these people, hey, how do you look at your country within the world, within the global environment? How do you look at Germany? Then you say, oh, Germany is a force for good in the world. Germany is there to bring peace and stability, etc., etc. So there is still that lingering belief of the Western bubble. There's still that lingering belief that somehow there's something good and proper about us as Westerners. And that's exactly what those diplomats and policymakers and civil servants also face in their actual foreign policy making. In reality, they just care about trade and they care about economic well-being and stopping migration if you're so inclined. They don't really deeply care about anything else, but there's still that identity cropping up and messing things about and creating inconsistency and incoherent policy making. And this is very likely to decline over time. This is not going to stop anytime soon. In the next decades, this will continue.
Well, in the preparation for this episode, you've called basically Western foreign policy a zombie that just slowly walks forward and says democracy, democracy, democracy.
But it doesn't know why it's saying it anymore. It doesn't believe in it. It doesn't have any intellectual. Zombies don't have any intellectual foundation to back up what comes out of their mouth. They basically say it because that's something in the past that they were told to say and told to believe without actually knowing why or how. Why are they walking in one direction? Why are they trying to eat you? Nobody knows, but they're still doing it.
And another problem with zombies, I mean, I haven't met too many of them personally, but they, at least in the movies, they don't have any accountability, right? A zombie just basically eats humans, right? And there's no accountability because nobody's going to tell that zombie, you know what, you can't eat other humans. Now let's translate this again to the foreign policy level. And we've discussed this at the beginning, that one of the really important things with consistency in foreign policy is that then there's accountability for your foreign policy choices and decisions. And if there is no consistency, if you are the foreign policy zombie of the West, then who can hold you accountable for what behavior? Because to what are we holding you accountable?
Yeah, we can't do it internally. So voters or the electorate, people can't do it. And externally, other countries cannot look at the West either and say, "Hey, you've done this, but this is wrong." There's no right and or wrong if you are this volatile, if you're this coherent. And again, there is that nice analogy with an individual human being. If you have a individual person who is all over the place, and one moment does this, one moment does that, one moment is the happiest, most generous person in the world, the other moment is a grumpy so and so, just complaining about everything, then this environment of that person will not be able to basically pull them back and say, could you please have a look at what you did yesterday, but because that was very uncomfortable, or you hurt me when you said that. That's impossible with someone who has no consistent, coherent approach. More importantly, that person will never learn because they don't know why they're behaving like this. They don't know why they are so volatile. And that's exactly the situation that the West is finding itself in. The West cannot learn anymore because they don't know why they're doing what they're doing. The rest of the world can't point it out to them because then all of a sudden they react sensitively and saying, hey, how dare you criticize us? We are the West. We've spoken enough about Israel-Palestine, but you can very clearly see that problem that they face right now there as well. South Africa is going to the ICC, is trying to take steps to hold Israel accountable, and the West has no idea how to react to that. The West doesn't know what to do about it, and as a result, the West is becoming a menace to the global society, much more so than China, much more so than many other countries in what people call the global South, because at least those countries have a consistent approach to the world, something that the West is sorely lacking.
And what now?
And this is not going to change anytime soon, right? I mean, with an individual, you can always have an intervention and you can say, you know what, maybe how about therapy, right? This is really toxic behavior. Or if that doesn't work and nobody, then you can just cut ties. You say, you know what, okay, this is it with our friendship. Thank you very much. I do no longer lead this toxic behavior. With countries, you can't really do that. And there's no, I mean, I don't know, do you have hope? I personally, as of now, unless all Western leaders suddenly start listening to this podcast and actually understanding what we're saying, I do not have any hope.
No, not in that sense. I don't have it either. Well, the hope comes from the fact that history will at some point change these dynamics. But how history does that is unclear. It could be through revolution, it could be through some kind of brilliant new insight that all of a sudden spreads around the globe. I don't think it necessarily will come from within the West. I think it will probably come from the outside where the Western can latch onto it. It does feel in many ways a little bit apocalyptic or a little bit dystopian in the sense that these zombies, we are moving towards a future without knowing why we're moving towards that future. We're trying to cling on to something that we've held dear, whereas the rest of the world is, has a plan. It's moving towards something. We're just desperately trying to cling on to what we've got, almost like the Roman Empire from the 4th and 5th century AD, right? Desperately trying to keep its positions close to it, while the rest of the world is now looking at what they want to accomplish, how they want to achieve their goals. I have hope in the sense that a globalized world is very dynamic and there will be new ideas, and that is not a matter of barbarians banging on the gate, destroying our society, but hopefully inspiring our society from the outside. I have hope because Sub-Saharan Africa is incredibly active and incredibly dynamic. I have hope because Asia is an incredibly diverse and very inspired continent in many ways. And I have hope that at some point the West will be able to look at that and say, hey, how can we learn from this and can we actually do something different? But until that day comes, no, we will be those zombies walking around making weird noises and basically annoying the rest of the world.
This seems like a great moment to end today's conversation on the institutional decline in Western foreign policy. If you have any questions, comments, or you heard a mistake we've made throughout the episode, please make sure to send us an email to thewesternbubble@gmail.com, and we will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week for the third part of this 3-part episode of The Western Bubble. That is it from my side. Balder, which closing quote did you pick for us today?
I chose a quote that I knew existed, but I wasn't quite sure who had said it originally. So I Googled it, and according to the internet, it's a quote from John C. Maxwell, who's an American author and speaker. However, I'm convinced that this is actually a quote from hundreds of years previous, maybe some French philosopher, maybe Voltaire or someone else. I just can't find it anymore. If any of our listeners know, please send us a message, and we will correct this. But for now, I will just attribute this to John C. Maxwell, because that's what the internet says. And he said, "He who thinks he leads but has no followers is only taking a walk."